I wanted to start by saying just a few words about what I think the possibilities are here and the kind of inspiration that I have when I think about these things. Now, we all have books that are kind of the canonical books that we read that really changed our lives. And one of the books for me, as I suspect it is for some other people in this room, is Jane Jacobs' classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And Jacobs in that book has a kind of a set piece at the beginning where she talks about a series of chapters called The Uses of Sidewalks. And one of the opening chapters is about the uses of sidewalks for safety in cities. And she's arguing in the early 60s for the power of kind of a crowded sidewalk, that sidewalks have this wonderful capacity for keeping neighborhoods safe, feeling safe, because there's so many eyes on the street. There are people out there kind of looking out for us. When you're on a crowded sidewalk, you feel safe because there are people around you who are all kind of collectively doing the work of keeping that space safe. And part of Jacob's point in that chapter is that the proper role for government is not to kind of structure the city landscape. It's not necessarily to decide where people should live or where the shops should go. It's just to make sure that there are sidewalks and not necessarily super highways or housing projects. And that if you create a sidewalk space where people are walking around and sharing that space, you'll have a healthy city. And in a sense, a sidewalk is a kind of platform. A sidewalk is a kind of platform for serendipity and cohesion and community and diversity. And if you build the right sorts of sidewalks, you'll create lively, interesting spaces. And I think in the context of journalism, one of the things that's become clear as we've gone through the newspaper crisis over the last few years is we're increasingly concerned about the status of the kind of heroic investigative reporter, the journalist who's there making sure that our cities are safe, that our government officials aren't abusing their power, that money isn't going into the wrong hands. And the question is, what's going to happen to that journalistic function that has an important social good? It's an important part of kind of our civic fabric that we have those people, those traditional trained journalists in the newsrooms that support them. Are they going to survive in this new kind of ecosystem, or is something going to come along to replace them, or are we going to lose that function altogether? And I think part of what I want to talk about today is, can we build, in a sense, kind of a government infrastructure and a public amateur civic journalistic infrastructure to support that kind of environment, to support those eyes and ears, to create new kinds of eyes and ears on the street that can play that kind of role for us in the future. I think there's an opportunity here where we basically evolve to a situation where we have fewer traditional journalists working in traditional newsrooms, but actually better investigative journalism, because so many tools are coming online, many of which we've seen already, that make the traditional journalist role so much more efficient and productive. That's the opportunity. That's at least what we should set our sights on doing. Whether we can pull it off or not, I think is what we're going to have to see over the next few years. And so we're really lucky, I think, to have Monica here, because as most of you know, the Seattle PI is really one of the great, kind of most interesting experiments right now in American news. And what they've done over the last, really, what it's been about 9 months? Since March, has really been reinventing what a kind of a newspaper means. I mean, for instance, we'll talk about this, but Monica's title is not technically reporter, it's news gatherer. And they're really trying to figure out what the new model is going to be for papers and the way that papers interact with citizen journalists. So I thought it would be useful to start with kind of an update from you, Monica, about what's been happening at the PI and how's it going?
Yeah, it really is it's an adventure. It's like no newsroom I've ever worked in. Not like I've been in the business that long, but I mean, among the things we're doing, we've got kind of an everyone can do everything value that's been permeating the newsroom. By the way, we had something like 180 people working at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer before the paper closed. We now have 20 on the editorial staff. So, among the things we had to do, we went from being a citywide news source that, like many citywide news sources, covers everything, to one that had to make some really tough choices about, well, we can't cover everything. We have to actually pick and choose our beats. So that means that we have a different function, and we fit in a different space in the news ecosystem of the city. So there's that. But the everyone is everything value is, for example, I'm a reporter. I'm also, the news gatherer is the title because there's this acknowledgement that reporting isn't just reporting anymore in the traditional sense. It's moderating the conversation that's happening around the news and around the issues of the day. It's aggregating, it's engaging with other media that are talking about your topics. So news gather is an attempt to kind of bring together that term. So I'm doing that, but I'm also, for example, this Saturday working a production shift. So I'm going to be running the SeattlePI.com website. And I've been trained to do that, and everybody, all the reporters are going to be trained to run the website. All the reporters are going to be trained to take as good photos as our one staff photographer, and we're all going to be trained to be editors. So it's just this sense that we all have to be doing everything. Data is obviously a very big component of this conference, and it's amazing. I mean, from what we've seen, among our most popular features, photo galleries are one. But anytime that we put up a database, it just takes off, and I think many news organizations have seen this happen. People like online to have raw materials. They like to play with things. They like to be able to become their own reporters. And so when you can enable that for them, it's one of the most productive things you can do as a journalist. So that journalism becomes not just reporting, gathering information, and bringing it to people. Sometimes it's just facilitating. Where is that data? Bring it out and give it to them. And sometimes that's all it takes, and that can be one of the most powerful tools. So you were mentioning investigative journalism. It's a very valid concern. All of this kind of push for hits, push for page views, push for productivity, lack of resources, layoffs in newsrooms across the country. Investigative journalism arose as something of a luxury because the profit margin in newspapers was so high. And now, there's a lot of investigative reporters being asked to write a blog, to spend less time. But I'm kind of with Stephen on this, that while there might be a loss there, there's also incredible potential for gain. And if governments provide the data, and then news organizations do their best to make it accessible, to make it customizable, to make it serve the reader, then we've got this really great cycle of just material and information for good citizenry just going around. And I think that's if you can enable people to become their own investigative reporters, that might be just as well.
That's great. I mean, I think the reason why we keep reaching for this word ecosystem to describe what's happening is I think that it captures something in the sense that the information is really flowing now, and that we're talking about kind of chains of information, the way that we talk about kind of food webs and chains of energy in a natural ecosystem, and I think that idea that you now have data that's exposed in a way that the greatest investigative journalists of the past could never have dreamed of, and then you've got a layer of people who are passionate about their communities, who are either blogging full-time or part-time or even just kind of tweeting, who have a great stake in that data, and who are going to uncover things that then become the basis for more rigorous, more professionally edited and written investigative journalist stories. So as long as we can keep the top of the chain alive in some fashion, which I think we've got a lot of different kind of ways of doing, the amount of data that's going to be flowing up through that process is going to be dramatically enhanced.
Absolutely.
And so to that point, like how has the PI been interacting with the kind of local blogging community in Seattle, which is an incredibly rich one?
Oh yeah, it's kind of being talked about as something of a laboratory for new media, new journalism, particularly our hyperlocal blogs. You guys have probably heard that term thrown around a lot. Seattle has some extremely rich, very diverse neighborhoods, and independent citizen journalists have risen from those neighborhoods to create sites. And I shouldn't say just blogs, because they include forums, they include all sorts of things. There's huge, just blockbuster sites. And they have so much of this kind of richness in that these are people who live in those neighborhoods. These are people who root for those neighborhoods. These are people that their readers can say, oh my gosh, she lives down the street, so she really knows what she's talking about. It's a new kind of authenticity, and it's a new kind of niche. So I mean, at Seattle PI, I think that we definitely recognize, because I don't know how you can't, that all of these levels in this ecosystem are very, very valuable and very valid. And I think, a couple years ago there was a definite, actually I know several of the bloggers, and they've told me about how in the beginning it was hard for them to gain legitimacy for their work. It was hard for them to go to their local police precinct and ask for data, get a press pass. But now, if anybody says no to those guys, that's bad news. It's just, they're growing so quickly, they're making money. They're hiring people. They're paying contributors. It's an incredible, we think of the news industry just dying in so many ways, but there are places where it's blossoming. So I think any successful news organization has to acknowledge that there are different parts of this ecosystem and value collaboration over competition. And acknowledge that maybe we don't have this for you, but this blog does, so let's lead you to it because this is information that you should know. So I'm really glad to see a lot of those just walls fall between competing media and more kind of talking to each other. I mean, I retweet what King 5, the TV station, writes, and they retweet what I write, and everybody's retweeting and resending and linking, and it's just one big happy family.
So Hal, you've done a lot of work trying to kind of visualize and map and figure out what's happening in this media ecosystem or media cloud as your project. So can you tell us a little bit about it? And we have some slides too, if they could put those up.
So the Media Cloud project at the Berkman Center is an attempt to gather the full content of hundreds of newspapers and thousands of blogs and other citizen media with an attempt to analyze what's going on in the media sphere by being able to ask questions, simple questions like what topics is the news media covering, and also a little bit harder questions like what sort of ideas pop up alongside given topics with given sources. How does the coverage of specific ideas differ between individual sources, and how do stories sort of rise and fall within the media sphere? Our role within this sort of world of transparency is to be the layer on top of the media. If we want to understand the government, we have to not only have the media asking questions of the government, but we have to understand what questions the media is actually asking and what questions they're not asking. So this is a very simple example of the kinds of things that we can do once we start gathering this data, which is a simple map of what countries are mentioned in various news sources. And you can see here very obviously the difference between two big mainstream sources, the New York Times and the BBC. The BBC is a little bit more national than the New York Times, but they look substantially similar. And Talking Points Memo, which looks vastly different. It's really only focused on the US. We can do a little bit more complicated work by digging into specific topics and asking how the media sphere in general covers a given topic. So what this slide shows right here are the kinds of words that are most used by mainstream and citizen media covering stories about corruption for a given time period around the Blagojevich scandal. In some sense, this is sort of interesting to visualize, but kind of obvious. Obviously, you have this big spike for Blagojevich right in the middle. But we can break that down further and start to ask questions about how newspapers differ from blogs. So we can look at newspapers alone, we can look at blogs alone, and the first thing that you'll start doing is giving yourself a headache trying to look at these and figure out what the differences are, because that's why it's interesting. So instead, we try to do that for you. And what this says right here is these words are the words that are used more in newspapers than in blogs when covering issues of corruption for this specific time period. And these start to give us some really interesting results, because what pops out of here immediately is all of these international words. That where the set of blogs is this sort of set of U.S. Political blogs, their conception of corruption is specific U.S. domestic issues, whereas the newspaper sources have this much broader international coverage, and also you see Salini, who's a local politician and more local in some senses. And we can do the opposite. We can look at blogs as well. And what you see here, interestingly, is that the blogs tend to cover not just more U.S. domestic issues in general, but they cover a lot more specific individuals. So you see mentions like Shinseki and Portman and Etheridge and Sabavian. Those are all sort of specific individuals that are actually being covered more intensely in the blogosphere than in newspapers. And then we can do this with sort of right versus left blogosphere as well, so we can see how ideologically how these questions are being covered. And the sort of interesting thing here is that, this actually looks like noise to some degree. the results aren't as good as we want. But what this actually represents, if you dig into this, is that the right blogosphere tends to cover corruption in a very large sense, if you look at these stories. So they talk about corruption and then build it into very large stories about other issues. So you end up with this large range of seemingly random words. That's because they're connecting the corruption as widely possible within the story of that they see about liberal politics. Whereas the liberal blogosphere, the most interesting thing here is the Guantanamo stuff that pops out that is not, obviously is not being collected to corruption from the conservative side. Another example is using these for stories about bailouts, so we can start to understand important governmental issues and how the media is covering them. Again, this is sort of interesting, but also kind of obvious that you have this peak of people talking about bailout, and they like to talk about economics and McCain and Obama. But we can, what we can do in addition to looking sets is we can go in and we can look at specific sources. So we can try to figure out not only in a large sense, but what are specific sources adding to the media sphere? What is the value they add? And we can do that comparatively as well. So the really interesting thing that you get here is, again, a sort of selling point for the New York Times, which points out all the international stuff that's being covered here that's not being covered in the blogs at all. So what you're getting from the New York Times that you're not getting from the blogosphere is you're getting information about Commerzbank and Frankfurt and all these other countries, and Darfur, very interesting mention in connection with the bailout. And then we can back up and we can do that in the reverse too. So we can look at specific examples like Matthew Iglesias or Althaus. With Althaus, again, what we see here is it's a pretty random collection of things, and when you start to dig into this stuff, you see again that what they're doing is they are connecting all of this stuff in to a larger story about liberalism and how they're screwing up the bailout, basically. And then finally, we come back and look at again at the New York Times, but in this case, just compared to Althaus, and even more strongly, we see all of these both international terms and policy terms. So we can see here very clearly that the way that Althaus is covering these issues is not dealing with with so much the policy or with international issues as with these sort of specific stories about liberalism.
So Hal, let me ask you a question to both you guys, but in a slightly different way. So you're sitting on top of all this kind of media activity and looking for interesting kind of emergent patterns that are there, and seeing what happens when you look at the media landscape from that new angle, right? What's the view that you would most like to have that's been the hardest to kind of get to? What's the kind of angle of attack to that data that you kind of dream about at night but haven't been able to kind of figure out?
So there's two things. One is a lot of the things that we found is it's much easier to do broad analysis of language on a sort of media source level. It's harder computationally. It's very hard to track individual stories and figure out where they're rising and falling. We'd love to be able to do that. But in a larger sense, what we're trying to do with this project is first provide these kinds of analytical tools so that we can sort of show results and also allow people to generate their own results like this. But what we're also trying to provide is an open platform, because we're having to do a lot of work. It costs some amount of money, but it takes a lot of work just to be able to get all these sources, to be able to clean out the text, to be able to present it in a way that you can use it. There are a handful of other academic efforts and a bigger handful of commercial efforts to do sort of similar work, but all those people are sort of repeating all this work. So one of the things we're trying to do is use Media Cloud as an open platform, both in a code sense. The code is already available. You can download the stuff and run it yourself. And we're also working very hard with the lawyers at the Berkman Center to figure out how much of this data that we can release. Right. So our strong goal is not just to use this data to answer the half a dozen questions that we think are really interesting, but to provide it as a sidewalk where anybody can come and ask questions that are more interesting and more powerful than the ones that we can figure out.
And Monica, from a journalistic news gathering perspective, what is it, particularly from the government side of things, that you really wish was readily accessible to you, that you could really kind of get your hands on, that's not yet available?
Yeah, I think among the most popular is crime stats. I think that on almost every level of news, that's just such an important thing for people to know, and especially with geo tagging and geolocation, if you can map out for people, these are all the assaults that happen on your block, and to be able to give them that data, it just it's a win-win for everybody. And we were talking about this earlier, but I'm kind of impressed, I guess, by how there's certain data that government shares and has shared very well for some time because it seems urgent. So the best example is probably traffic. I mean, in Seattle and King County and probably in a lot of places, traffic data is very instantaneous. It just gets out there. We have these really state-of-the-art maps. You can go online and figure out your bus route really easily. Great tools. They keep updating it. I think they just, upgraded their website. Also, Twitter and Facebook and social media in Seattle, the ways that government agencies have been using those the fastest and the most effectively is with, weather alerts, transportation alerts, traffic alerts. And they've been doing a heck of a job. It's been great. But I'm kind of asking, well, okay, that data's all very urgent, and it's probably arguably, more necessary on a give it to me now level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only data that should be so open, So if governments can kind of take the attitude they take with traffic and just kind of say, well, why don't we try to do the same and make this other data as accessible? Crime, I think, is a huge one. It's just absolutely enormous. But there's all sorts of, public utilities, I think would be really cool to know, trash pickups and, whatever it is, energy expenditures, construction expenses. You can just map so much, and it tells such a story about where you live for the people who live there, that words just can't tell. And people will be able to zoom right into where they want, and again, enabled to be their own reporters. So, I think that those are the big ones.
In part, it strikes me that one of the roles that newspapers should take on now is to precisely do these kinds of innovative new user interfaces for all that data that's out there. That this is historically the paper has played this role of being a kind of narrative interface for news. We're going to tell the stories, and that continues to be the role. But their new opportunity is to turn all that information that's there into something that's intelligible that other people can look at and manipulate. And clearly, there's been work in that direction, but there's a lot of opportunity, I think, going forward. And you were saying that you have database training, right, as part of your job, that's coming up, right, on the next...
Yeah. So along with the, everyone must do everything, so we're all being trained on how to do everything, we were also recently informed that we are all to, make databases of... one is actually, we're assigned two. One is information that we can scrape from somewhere already online. The second one has to be information that is not readily available that we have to get. So, and through that, we're going to learn this system called Caspio that I guess a lot of news organizations use, and to make databases. So not just lists of data, but the reader goes in and puts in a zip code and learns about crime stats, whatever it is. So yeah, we're all kind of doing that, and just so we can become more familiar with that tool, because I think there's this huge realization that it's going to be so powerful. It already is. But it's only going to get more important. And
how we're about to run out of time. But do you think that these tools that you've been developing are going to be useful for journalists as they're kind of doing their work to kind of have meta information about what they've been doing and what their peers are doing? Is that part of the role here, you think?
Yes, this is one of the sort of core uses we imagine for this, is just being able to tell. If you don't know what it is you're covering and not covering, it's hard to improve your coverage, right?
Right.
So one of the core things that we hope to do is to be able to take that analysis where you can look at the New York Times or you could look at the Seattle PI and ask, how does the Seattle PI look compared to other newspapers? How does it look compared to this other specific competitor? How does it look compared to blogs? And then you can see how you're positioning yourself within the market, if it looks like how you think it looks like, if there are questions that are being asked that you're not asking.
Great. I think one of the things that occurs to me, just to wrap up, sitting here looking at this day, is we often talk about the role of journalism and its relationship to government as being adversarial, that we're supposed to be there to keep that power in check, and indeed that is a core part of the responsibility of being a journalist. But you look at something like today, and you look at all the innovative stuff that's happening both inside the public sector and outside the public sector in terms of these new experiments. And it's part of, I think, our role as journalists to point to the things that the government does well every now and then, right? When you think about things like 311, which is just a fantastic service that does really interesting things with technology, and that it's changed people's lives in a bunch of ways, that we don't spend enough time pointing to those things because the government doesn't do a very good job of marketing its successes. And so when you don't take the time to celebrate those successes when they come up, you run into this problem, which we saw a little bit of earlier this morning, where we have this default, the government always messes things up kind of attitude. And so we should take the opportunity to kind of point to the things that are working well when they do work well, because we don't hear enough about those, I think. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for listening to us.